Neither. Okay, listen. One, I gotta record. Apparently, there's no Great Depression lecture recorded. Period. So bear with me. This is going to be recorded. Therefore, some of you might want to wait until the advisory time to ask certain questions.
No, I got that.
Lest they end up on the.
I'm asking the right question.
Well, I mean,
Think about that.
you're asking
I'm
questions.
asking good questions. Mr. Baker, you're just making me want to ask more questions.
There's gonna be like 5 years down the road, something like who's.
All right, so this is the last topic we need to cover prior to your unit test on Friday. All right, we'll back up a little bit, cover the very tail end of the 1920s again, and then we'll move into the 1930s. So some of this should be at least a little bit review, right? So we should remember from our previous discussions, Herbert Hoover took over on the death of Warren Harding. Hoover is, sorry, not Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge. All right, Calvin Coolidge took over upon the death of Warren Harding. Coolidge then runs in 1924. He has sort of his own little personal catastrophe while he's in office, decides not to seek re-election in 1928.
That's where I had 4.
Right? That's going to lead to the election of Herbert Hoover, who had been a businessman. He had been Secretary of Commerce under Harding and then under Coolidge. Considered to be very intelligent, astute, and capable in terms of running the government. It's also worth noting that he wins very, very, very easily. Okay? And in understanding that ease of victory, it's probably worth noting, and I don't know that we've really talked about it in any depth before, that many Americans, most if not like a supermajority of Americans, tend to vote economically, predominantly, right? You can have all of the wonderful ideals that you want, right? You can believe in gender equality or a woman's right to choose or whatever, right? But if you are starving, right, if the economy is terrible, you can't afford like rent or food or things of that nature, as a general rule, that will cause people to sort of bypass their ideals in order to meet their sort of survival necessity, right? So that means that when you look at the economy as a significant indicator for the outcome of an upcoming election, right? When the economy is doing well, the status quo will win. When the economy is doing poorly, the status quo will lose, right? So again, we had a presidential election just a few months ago. How are we doing economically?
Pretty good.
Pretty bad.
Terrible.
Dude, eggs are now $8 a dozen.
I don't go to the store. So
That's almost a dollar an egg.
Tell me you're rich, Sean, without telling me you're rich.
His maid died.
Well, he doesn't yet, but I mean,
His maid goes to the grocery
Hell yeah.
no, but lots, I mean, here's the thing, guys, honestly, like, this is one of the things why rich people are generally are more insulated from things like this. They're less responsive to economic turmoil, because if you are wealthy, you go to the grocery store and just buy what you buy and you don't really pay attention, right? If you are not wealthy, then you will absolutely be paying attention to those things, right? And so the economy in the United States was not doing great, right? Even though Kamala Harris was not president of the United States, she did represent the status quo. Why would you keep the status quo when the status quo is economically poor, right? I mean, comically, Donald Trump also lost because his economy was poor in 2020, and then he won re-election in 2024. What?
When we have because like you said in the future, we're probably gonna have a hyperinflation. When we have that, do you think it's gonna be like more like status quo voting? Because like the economy is like super inflated already.
No, no, hyperinflation is not good, dude.
No, because I was thinking about that.
No, hyperinflation is not good. So when I say status quo, we're talking about good or bad, right? If things are going well, right, we will continue to vote for the same party that is already in office. If things are going poorly, we will change, right? 2008, for instance, we had just had the housing crisis in America, right? Bush was president of the United States. John McCain was the Republican candidate in 08, and therefore McCain is the status quo. Republicans were Republican, even though McCain was not in office, he was not part of the executive branch at all, he was a senator at the time, right? He would represent the status quo, therefore Obama wins because Obama represents upsetting the status quo, and the status quo created poor economic situation, right? That being said, when you look at the 1920s, the 1920s is a wonderful economic situation, right? Herbert Hoover represents the economic status quo of Coolidge, and therefore he wins in a landslide, right? He wins the election very, very easily, right? And then, unfortunately for him, right, if we understand how sort of electoral politics work, okay, you are elected in November of a year divisible by 4, right? So 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so 1928, he is elected. He will not take office until March of 29. Okay, now, during FDR's administration, we're actually going to change the Constitution to move that up to January to decrease what we call the lame duck period, which we'll eventually get to. Okay, but Herbert Hoover takes office in March of 1929. And then we know in October of 1929 what happens.
The
The stock market crash, and that is the trigger for the Great Depression, right? So understand that. Hoover would have, if positive times had been maintained, theoretically, Hoover would have continued the Calvin Coolidge progressive conservatism, right? Which is more of a socially progressive, economically conservative mentality, right? Which is sort of the opposite of what Woodrow Wilson was, who was economically progressive and socially conservative.
So was Hoover a good president or a bad president overall?
I mean, Hoover is going to go down in history as one of the worst,
Because of the
right? But he goes down in history as one of the worst because of the Depression. The reality is, in America, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. In America, we provide or we assign blame or credit to presidents of the United States way too easily.
Yeah.
Way too easily, right? The reality is, I mean, whose fault was hyperinflation, or not hyperinflation, but the substantial inflation, the worst of my lifetime inflation that we just got over?
Trump.
Trump? Were you gonna blame Trump?
Well, I don't know.
But here's the thing, so listen, just so we're crystal clear, if you identify as a Republican, right, and we'll get into this in more detail next year in government, you identify as a Republican, it's Biden's fault. You identify as a Democrat, it's Trump's fault. You know whose fault it really is?
The feds.
People.
Is there a road?
The feds.
Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, the federal reserve. Screw that.
It's actually Woodrow Wilson's fault. It's the fault of the Fed. That's the actual fault, right? But then, it's not just the Fed, it's actually Congress who authorized the Fed to spend a whole bunch of money that didn't exist, which is what basically pumped an extra $5 trillion in cash, like, into circulation. And when you increase circulation by $5 trillion, or whatever the actual number is, I don't know off the top of my head what the actual number is, right? But we basically printed off a whole bunch of currency in order to just give it to people who weren't working or doing anything in exchange for it, right? That is the very definition of inflation. So is it actually Trump's fault? No.
No.
Was he petty in demanding that his name be on the check that got mailed to your house? Yes. Biden was equally as petty, right? But the reality is, it's neither one of those men's fault if we fully understand all of the variables that go into play there. So when we look at the Great Depression, is it really Herbert Hoover's fault? No, right? But Hoover's going to take the blame, right? Right. At some point in time, Americans need an easily blamable figure. You need somebody to point at and be like, it's her fault.
Scapegoat.
Some sort of scapegoat, yes. Right? That is a relatively common occurrence within history, and especially when it comes to politics. which is so nuanced and so complex that there are so many different variables that go into effect that it's not ever just one thing. All right. So we already covered this. We covered Black Tuesday. We know that we had a soaring stock market. That stock market goes into free fall. Right? So there goes a whole bunch of actual wealth. There goes a whole bunch of money that people had. Right? It is now just gone. It was money invested into the stock market and is essentially, for lack of a better term, disappeared overnight as a result of a substantial decrease in the value of stocks. Right? By 1930, then, you see a substantial number of businesses that begin to shut down. Right? And so now what happens? This is sort of the opposite of a hyperinflationary state. Right? All of a sudden, we're in a depressive state. Okay? Now, that's different than saying depression, but a depressive state means that the value of things is decreasing significantly, right? The value of the stock market has decreased significantly, right? Businesses have begun to go under. They have shut their doors. They have stopped continuing to operate. That puts people out of work. Thus, they have less money. Thus, they have less purchasing power. Thus, everything continues to decrease in value. Right? That is different than a hyperinflationary depression, right? Where the cost of everything begins to skyrocket. Yes, sir.
So depression is way worse than increase, like.
No. So to say depression just simply means that the economy is getting worse. There are multiple ways in which depressions can actually play out. Right? So a hyperinflationary state would be a depression, right? But this is basically the opposite of hyperinflation. This is depression, right, or deflation. The value of things have gone down.
Is this worse than hyperinflation?
They're just different. They're just different. I don't know that I would say one is worse than the other, but if we go back to that analogy of like the crumbling house that you're trying to get out of, it just means it's a different exit that you want to go through. All right, so we recognize that the stock market crash in 1929 is the sort of trigger for the Great Depression, right? But that is not the cause of the Great Depression, right? That is simply evidence that the Great Depression has existed. So now the question becomes, what is the cause of the Great Depression? And number one, right, we have overproduction, and then because we have overproduction, we have underconsumption. And so this is a basic chart right here on the whiteboard that is a graph of what supply and demand looks like, right? So you have price, right? Here you have the quantity that's being produced there, right? Laura learned all of this in economics. Kidding, she remembers none of this because none of y'all will ever remember anything that you learned in economics. I don't know why. Right? But the idea here is that the less something costs, the less suppliers want to provide of it because obviously they're not making any money. Therefore, the more it costs, the more they want to supply. Right? The higher the cost, the less people are demanding. They don't want the product. Right? The lower the cost, the more they're going to demand. Right? Because, you know, if I offered Ethan a slice of pizza for, well, actually I should probably go with Tom in third period, right? If I offered Tom a slice of pizza for like a quarter, right? That dude's probably gonna buy like 3 whole pies, right? And then eat all 3 of them by himself.
He's done that.
Have you really? I don't know. Tom,
I have a quick
is this true? Is Tom not gonna wrestle anymore?
I don't know if it's just next year.
Okay. That boy, for the sake of his general health, he got stopped. But you understand? So you understand the basic concept in here of supply and demand? Yes.
It's going up to 165.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So what happens then? Right. What happens in an overproduction state? Right. We have overproduction. That means that suppliers are producing more than what people want to buy. And we are no longer at this point at equilibrium. Instead, we are somewhere up here, right? Which means here's the quantity that we are producing, and then if this is the cost, there's the amount that we are actually purchasing, right? This is called an excess, okay? Excesses are bad economically. Because let's just say, for the sake of argument, you had a pencil factory. You were making like the old wooden pencils, right, that you used to take the SAT with. Right, so you have to buy wood and graphite and rubber for the erasers and the little metal to like hold the eraser to the pencil and all that wonderful stuff, yes? You then have to pay laborers to actually put those pencils together. So you make 1 million pencils, but only 100,000 sell. What happens?
Well, you have a stock of.
I've got 900,000 pencils, but if I am the pencil manufacturer, what is the very first thing that I'm going to do as a result?
Lower the price.
No.
Make less pencils.
What? I'm going to stop producing, right? So that means that if Ethan is one of my employees, what happens?
He can
Yeah.
never take work.
Bye! You have a job. You fired.
Oh,
Right?
That's Joey.
And now, here's where this becomes sort of wildly problematic, right? If I fire Ethan, what happens to Ethan?
That doesn't have a job.
You don't have a job, so
You can't buy
you
it.
can't buy anything. So what happens to my pencils? Even fewer people are now going to have the means to buy my pencils.
I mean, wouldn't the second thing on the list be to lower the price of the pencils so people buy?
Well, but here's the problem. If I lower the price of the pencils too much, then I'm not making any money. This is actually the problem with farmers, right? Because this is the substantial difference economically between production of some sort of good, like a pencil, that theoretically I could just stash. I mean, I could take all of those boxes. God only knows how many boxes 900,000 pencils would be, but I would assume I could fit all of those boxes in like a bedroom in my house, right? Might take up the whole bedroom, I have no idea, but let's just say for the sake of argument, that's what I did, right? I could just keep those pencils in my house until the market for pencils went back up, and then I could begin to sell them again, yes? Right? What happens for a farmer though?
Well, that's
His
what that
crops die out and all that.
Right, so now if I'm a farmer and I'm producing corn and I've overproduced corn and therefore the cost or the value of corn has gone down drastically, I have to compete at the market to sell the corn before the corn goes bad, thus continuing to lower the price. Now, that means that if it cost me, for the sake of argument, it cost me 25 cents to produce an ear of corn, and I was selling every ear of corn for 30 cents, that means I make a nickel per ear of corn I sell,
Yeah.
right? But what happens in a depressive state like this for like farmers is now all of a sudden the cost of an ear of corn goes down to 20 cents, right? So what do?
Can't do it. You have to sell.
I still have to sell, right? Because I need to at least recoup the 20 cents, because if I don't sell it for the 20 cents, I'm left with nothing,
Yeah. So you're
right? At that point, I have absolutely nothing. So we can reach into a point where you can't just be like, oh, lower the price. Just lower the price of the pencil, then we'll be fine. Well, no, if my production costs have now exceeded the value that I could recoup for the pencil, I can't lower my prices enough to actually compete in a market that way, right? Without sort of destroying my own business or my own livelihood. Okay? All right, so you have that. Number two, skyrocketing inequality. In fact, during the 1920s, this is actually where we get the concept of, or the idea of trickle-down economics, right? And we'll talk about that again near the end of the semester when we get to the 1980s. Anybody know what trickle-down economics is?
If the rich people make a lot of money, the poor people get the piece of that pie because the rich people provide the jobs.
Well, so here's the thing. First, does trickle-down economics work?
No.
No.
Yes.
Oh,
Shit.
I mean, technically,
Oh.
right? Like, here's the deal.
It's like communism.
Anybody ever seen like the champagne waterfall thing?
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about, right? Like, I don't know, maybe some of you have read Gatsby, like you can see it in the movie Gatsby if y'all watch the movie too, right? But what happens, right? You pour champagne into this very top glass, yes? Right? And then this glass overflows and it goes down to the next tier, and then this glass overflows, right? And we continue to go down and down and down and down and down. That is the very concept of trickle-down economics, right? When we engage in trickle-down economics, right? And basically what we do is we flood the top level, right? Do poor people get richer? Yes! I mean, yes, they make money. But here's the problem, right? Because one of the basic tenets of sort of capitalism, right? Or one of the stereotypes of capitalism that is probably true and you ought to understand is that it takes money to make money, yes?
Yeah.
Right? We talked about it when we talked about the 1920s, and we talked about easy credit, and we talked about buying stock on speculation, right? Okay, so Ethan has $5. Ethan invests $5 in the stock market, and after a 10-year period, stocks have soared. They've gone up 100%. Ethan has $10. Yay! Congratulations, Ethan.
That's dope.
Right?
You can buy me a
Sean has $500,000. He invests $500,000 in the stock market on the exact same day that Ethan does. After 10 years, Sean has $1 million. So here's the thing. Did Ethan get richer?
Yeah, but also.
Technically, yes. Technically, yes. Ethan did get richer. In fact, Ethan's net worth doubled.
Mine did too.
But so did Sean's.
Hell yeah.
Right? And so then what you end up with is a situation, put that down. Okay? You end up in a situation where these people at the top, even if they have the same return, right? If the yield is the same, Sean doubled his money, Ethan doubled his money, right? But what actually happened, right? What actually happened is that the gap in their wealth increased significantly, right? It increased significantly. And that's one of the things that we see happening here in the 1920s, right? Which will ultimately create some significant problems as well. And just so we're crystal clear, you are looking at similar concepts happening in the United States today, right? We have an income inequality in this country that is going to be one of the significant problems, right? And could end up as one of the catalysts for some sort of depression or state that is going to require this to be rectified in one way or another. Next, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. What is the tariff?
It's a tax on imports.
Tax on imports, right? Why do we tax imports?
So we can make things at home, so we make more money.
To protect American industry, right? Oh, we're in a depression, right? So what do we need? We need people to go to work in America. How do we get people to go to work in America? We create American manufacturing jobs. How do we make sure that manufacturing is done in the United States? Let's put tariffs on imports coming into the country, right? That way, if you're making an air conditioner in Mexico and I'm making an air conditioner in the United States and I put a tariff on yours, people will buy mine. That's good for the American economy, isn't it?
Kind of.
Well, it absolutely is, right? But the problem is the world doesn't exist in a vacuum. If the United States puts a tariff on Mexico, what is Mexico likely to do to the United States?
Tariff on America.
Put a tariff on America. Right? And so here's the thing. That may cause me to slightly increase the production and sale of air conditioners in the United States. Right? But now all of a sudden I've harmed a different industry that has a reciprocal tariff applied to them by Mexico. Right? So, does the U.S. import more or export more? In the 1920s.
Export.
It's actually significantly worse. Right? Because we're exporting a great deal of things, and now exports will decrease. Right? And then finally, European nations have all kinds of chaos as a result of World War I, right? World War I devastated infrastructure and economies within Europe, and they're having to rebuild. Okay? And that is actually detrimental. In fact, Weimar Germany ends up in a hyperinflationary state. Right? So if you ever want to understand what hyperinflation is, look at Germany at the end of the 1920s. The German economy basically tanks, right? It's destroyed, and that's what allows Adolf Hitler to rise to power. What's up?
When it, like, didn't World War II, it flipped completely because there was so much debt to, like, people?
What?
Like, for Germany.
Well, no. One of the great things about hyperinflationary Germany is they're massively in debt as a result of war reparations from World War I. Fine, I'll just print off more money and give it to you. I've met my debt obligation. I'll give you something.
Oh, so the
I
same
don't
thing
care.
happens in World War II?
What?
The same thing happens in World War II?
No, we don't have the same punitive, quite as punitive peace agreement following World War II. Right? We learn from our mistakes. I mean, following World War II, we created the United Nations and we allowed Germany to join. Right? I mean, Germany and Japan are members of the UN. Right? They were not welcome in the League of Nations. Alright? So, what happens to the actual people? We see significant unemployment in the United States first, right? This is part of the depression that exists, right? During the Great Depression, unemployment will rise almost to, or roughly to, 25%, I believe. I think it comes close to 25%, right? Just so we understand, because sometimes numbers are tricky to understand, right? What is unemployment at in America today?
I couldn't tell you.
It's under 10%.
It's well under 10%. No, I don't think it's that low. I think we're around 3 or 4%, right? I think we're around 3 or 4% right now, right? I don't know the exact number. The number changes.
4%.
What?
4%.
4 flat?
4 flat as of January 2025.
Okay. Usually they put usually it's like 4.2 or 3.9. They don't, I mean, it could be 4 flat, but they don't generally round that to a whole number. They generally round it to a decimal, depending on where you're getting your data from. But here are some other points that we need to understand, right? So let's just say for the sake of argument, we're going to use nice round flat figures. It is 4% today, right? And just so I can do the math, because you know me, I suck at math, right? During the Great Depression, let's just pretend that the unemployment rate is 24%, right? That means that unemployment during the Great Depression is how many times as bad?
6.
Look at you doing math back there in your head so well. Yeah, 6 times worse. 6 times worse. Now, here's the other really, really dicey, complex idea, right? How many of you are currently unemployed? Put your hand
Raise your hand.
down. None of you are unemployed.
I knew it. It's always
Oh,
a
wait,
trick
school.
question.
None of you are unemployed.
The school-
Why are none of you unemployed?
Because we're
Go to
students.
school.
Because you're under the age of 18, right?
I'll be unemployed.
So you don't count in unemployment statistics.
So does that mean I'm not employed?
No, interestingly enough, you are employed, Ethan,
I'll be
Hell
unemployed.
yeah.
right?
for a month.
But here, so, and Ethan's actually a decent example of this, right? Gabe, you said you'd be 18 in a month?
Yep.
So, in a month, Gabe turns 18. In 1 month, will Gabe count as unemployed?
Yep.
Yeah.
No. Because not only do you have to be 18, you have to be actively looking for work to count as unemployed.
He's not
Okay.
employed.
Now, Ethan, we've talked about your salary before. You make a decent salary for, a guy who slings sandwiches, right? No
Burgers.
offense.
Hey, can you put it?
Well, they do have burgers too. I've eaten there. It's not bad. But could you live? First of all, how many hours a week do you work on average?
Like 4?
4. Okay, so could you live even with your decent hourly wage? Could you live on that work? No. Okay, so Ethan would be by definition underemployed. But do we take that into account with unemployment?
No.
Nope, he's just employed. Right? So I do want you to understand when we say that 4% of Americans are unemployed, that number can actually be significantly worse than what that data set is leading you to believe. Right? And that goes back to a conversation that we had before about how easy it is to manipulate numbers. Yes? Right? I can make numbers say what I want based upon how I want to say them. Okay? Alright, so by 32, 12 million are unemployed. Again, we get all the way up to roughly a quarter of Americans are unemployed, and that means a quarter of people that are actually looking for work, not the people who just threw up their hands and gave up. Okay? As a result of significant unemployment, that means people have less money, right? We have homelessness and hunger that also result from this, right? So you have malnutrition of children. Okay? I mean, you have people living literally in cardboard boxes. Okay? There is not enough charity and social programs capable of keeping up with the displaced and the hungry and all of that. right? So, as government begins to get involved, how is government going to deal with some of these issues, right? Number one, married women, not allowed to have a job. Can't work, go home, right? I mean, don't pop out like 8 kids because you can't afford to feed them either,
Papa.
right? But go home. You are not allowed to work,
Damn.
right? We are going to prevent married women from working because their husbands ought to be able to make enough in order to sustain the family, right? What about single women?
They can work.
In certain jobs,
Women's
right? We still have to try to take care of the guys, right? Because men are providers and women are just women, right? Okay? So, can you take a job as a seamstress or something of that nature? Yes, right? What about minorities?
Yeah, but no. The way you looked at me, no.
Well, they'll be like second choice.
Correct, right? So what that means is, like, let's look at black people first, right? It's 1930, we are still in the midst of the Jim Crow era in the South, right? So we have systemic racist programs that are designed to prevent black people from taking white people's jobs in the South. What about in the North?
They can have the same.
They're a second option, right? Generally, if a factory has to lay off workers, they're going to lay off the minority workers first and the white workers second. If they need to hire somebody first, they're going to hire a white worker first and a black worker second. Yes, sir.
So, does a minority man have a higher chance than a woman in this, like, at this time to get a job?
I don't know what the actual data would say because they're not in competition with one another, right? Because the women are only capable of taking jobs that are, again, what we would refer to today as pink collar jobs, right? Meaning women are only capable of taking jobs as a seamstress or a maid or something of that nature. A job that a man would not be applying to in the first place. All right? And then Mexican Americans, just so we're crystal clear, there have been multiple instances in American history in which the United States has advocated for and actively sought Mexican Americans to cross the border, come into the United States, and engage in labor, right? I mean, we're just stereotyping. Hopefully we understand that white people are way too arrogant to be the one to, like, mow another white person's lawn, right? Or pick their strawberries, or whatever, right? There have been a number of jobs over the course of time that we have essentially outsourced to Mexican labor, right? And I do mean Mexican because we didn't have, like, the massive migration from further into Latin America. You're talking about people that were really just coming across the border and they're coming into southern towns. They weren't going to, like, Minnesota either, right? But we are going to utilize Mexicans as scapegoats in this instance. We're going to deport a whole bunch of them and try to get rid of them because now, if you are unemployed, if you're an unemployed white man in 1933, right, are you going to take a job on a California farm picking strawberries?
Yeah.
Yes. If your option is pick strawberries or starve to death, you will pick strawberries. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. All right. The Dust Bowl. This is actually also a. You know what? Let's just go ahead and call it that. It's a climate crisis. Right? No, climate crisis. Right? This is actually why climate scientists probably ought to look at a little bit more history. Right? We know where the Midwest is. Yes, the breadbasket of America.
Yes.
Right? This area right here. Yeah. Right? What do we grow there? Wheat, corn, grains. Yes, we grow bread. No, we don't grow bread. But eventually we make bread out of the stuff that we grow. Okay. Now, we talked about this once already with Jamestown. What happened in Jamestown as it pertained to agriculture, Chloe?
They didn't know how to farm because they were all looking for gold.
Once they started farming.
Once they start, wait, wasn't it like winter when they started? Wait.
Jamestown became successful
Oh.
and flourished because of what, Maya? Which product?
That was close.
Tobacco. Right?
That was both of them.
And Michael, what eventually happened? and everybody lived happily ever after?
No.
And Jamestown is the richest place in America today.
No.
No!
If you overfarm
sorry.
soil, quality goes
What,
down.
Ethan?
If you overfarm soil, quality goes down.
So they overfarm the area, right? Because they're greedy, right? They overfarm, they strip the land of nutrients, trying to grow even more and more and more tobacco in order to make more and more and more money.
Does Jamestown still exist?
Yes. But it's more of like a history, society place. Okay? So, we have a similar issue in the Midwest. Again, we have overproduction, right? We are not being very efficient in sort of crop rotations and things like that. And then we also have a massive drought, right? Which is again why, like, climate you ought to look at history, right? And because does the Mississippi River Valley area flood regularly? Yes, it has forever, right? Does it experience occasional droughts? Yes, it has forever, right? These are not new occurrences as a result of American industrialization, okay? So what ends up happening then is between the overfarming and the drought, right? What happens to the land? What happens to the soil?
Well, it becomes really, really dusty.
Right? It becomes incapable of maintaining the agricultural production, right? And then ultimately, once you couple into the drought, it looks far more like a desert, right? And we remember, we talked about this when Americans, or when Europeans first got here, right? What did they call this area? They called it a desert. They assumed that it was a desert because Native Americans did not grow crops there, right? And so maybe at some point in time, Native Americans tried to grow crops there, and there was a prolonged season of drought, and they were like, "Nah, forget this, we're not doing it. We'll follow the buffalo and we'll just pick wild berries and things like that." All right? So now, once you have that, you end up in a situation where it almost becomes desert-like, right? Anybody seen the movie The Mummy?
Wait, what's it about?
About a mummy, right?
I feel like open it to
Okay, I'm just gonna use the word then, although all of you are gonna snicker and giggle like school kids. You know the word haboob?
Yeah, what's the money?
You actually pay attention to the mummy. A haboob is a sandstorm.
Even you knew the word, you
Yeah,
still
I
laugh,
still
bro.
laugh.
That's how it's still laughing.
The one person who knew what the word meant still snickered like a 6-year-old girl.
Bro, you're an adult in
Like
this
the
room.
only one.
Haboobs are sandstorms that happen in the Middle
Michael,
East.
no way it's that.
Well, they still happen in Arizona now, right? This is essentially what we get in the Midwest. We call them dust storms. These dust storms are so massive, so catastrophic that they will essentially black out the sky. They will go through ranches, right, and choke off and kill the cattle. Right, you would open the cattle up afterwards, and like all 4 stomachs of the cattle would be full of dirt.
They got 4 stomachs.
Yes, cows have 4 stomachs.
Does this kill people?
How do you not learn that in like
Wait,
biology?
what?
I can tell you the order.
Of course you can. You're an FFA. You better be able to.
He took
Right.
it dirt.
So now, what happens to the people in the Midwest then? Once all of this is occurring, what would you do in that situation?
Stay in my house?
Move out of there.
Seal my windows.
Ma'am, I would leave. I would leave and go elsewhere.
I'd follow the buffalo.
I would run.
Well, Americans have already killed we killed the buffalo 50 years ago.
I let the wind take me.
40 years ago? I don't know.
Buffalo still exists? Wait, no, not like it still exists, but like, are they?
Fantastic.
Buffalo are predominantly protected animals anymore. We talked about this with the Native American unit, like actually the way that the white man was able to really devastate Native Americans, especially the Plains Indians. You don't even really have to hurt them. You don't have to do anything to them. Just kill all the buffalo, right? And once you killed all of the buffalo, you killed their life. You killed their sustenance. You killed their clothing. You killed their food. You killed what they were making their teepees, their mobile homes out of. Like, you killed their way of life, and at that point they have no choice but to accept reservation life and just go live off of whatever the American government is willing to provide on a monthly basis.
I don't know why they base their entire tribe off one animal.
Because that's.
That just doesn't make sense.
Well, I mean,
From.
one, I would actually tell you that and maybe we should have covered this in more detail in our Native American unit. I mean, the Native Americans are actually really efficient when it comes to like the buffalo, right? Like they use the bone for tools or arrowheads. Like there's not a part of the buffalo really that goes to waste. So. All right, so here's what I want you to understand. Herbert Hoover is going to try, he is actually going to try to do stuff, right? And again, we talked about this. Hoover is going to go down as a very poor president because of all of this, but Hoover actually does not just sit there and like sit in the Oval Office in the White House and be like, I don't know what to do, this is terrible, it sucks. He actually tries to fix the problems, and some of the things that he does are actually probably the correct action. And interestingly enough, he doesn't get any of them accomplished. He tries to do things, and Congress stops him, right? And then, even more comically, we'll get to FDR tomorrow, FDR does some of the things that Herbert Hoover tried to do. Congress lets FDR do it, and then we're all like, yay, FDR, he was so great. Okay? So, what happens? Right? One, he tries to increase taxes. Interestingly enough, sometimes in an economic downturn, that is actually the right move. Right? How? In a hyperinflationary state, government absolutely should increase taxes. Right? If government increases taxes in a hyperinflationary state, government takes more of the money out of circulation. Now, the problem is government would then turn around and spend it because they always do, but they shouldn't. Increase taxes, decrease spending, and you can help control inflation. Okay? But Hoover can't get his tax increase passed in order for the government to be actually able to do things. Right? He actually just tries to like boost people's morale and be like, hey, we've had economic downturns before, it'll be okay. Right? What does FDR do when he takes office? He has his little fireside chats where he gets on the radio and he's like, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. And everybody goes, oh my God, that FDR is so wonderful. He makes me feel better about myself. Well, Hoover tried the same thing, but nobody cared. Right? Okay? But ultimately, Hoover is weary of too much governmental assistance because too much governmental assistance is the very idea of socialism, right? And so this conservative idea of individualism, self-reliance, is going to prevent too much of that from happening, right? Congress, at this point in American history, Congress is still in charge. That's worth noting. Okay? Up until 1932, Congress has really only relinquished control twice. Okay? That's to Andrew Jackson, who took it, right? And then to Abraham Lincoln, who Congress kind of gave it to, right? And then when Lincoln died, Congress came back real hard and took it from Andrew Johnson. They were not going to let Johnson be in charge of Reconstruction, right? So Congress is ultimately the ones that are in charge, right? And so then what happens? Congress is elected every 2 years, right? So Hoover is elected in 28. We have a congressional election in 1930, and guess who pretty much sweeps the congressional elections in 1930?
The people who are not successful.
Right? So they get a majority in the House and a near majority in the Senate. And the reason that it's a near majority in the Senate is because the entire Senate is not up for re-election every 2 years. Only a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So that means we're going to have a whole bunch of Republican holdovers, right? But Democrats are going to make electoral gains in 1930, significant electoral gains, right? And so Hoover is then going to get pressured by Congress to do some things, right? Like providing emergency loans to banks and railroads and things that are meant to create some level of recovery, right? And government investment into the jobs market, right? And the reality is in a depressive state like this, it actually is advantageous. It is advantageous for the United States government to increase spending in order to stimulate economic growth, right? And we'll see when we get to FDR. FDR is going to increase governmental spending predominantly on infrastructure projects, right? Because infrastructure projects is the best way that the government can spend money, right? That means building dams, building roads, laying power lines, right? All sorts of things of that nature. All right, so we get to the election of 1932. In 1932, Herbert Hoover is going up against the Democratic governor of New York in FDR, right? And FDR is ultimately going to win this election by an absolute landslide, which is always even more comical, right? When you consider that he won in a landslide, right? But if you were to like look at the polling data, right? If you were to look at who the newspapers said was going to win, they said Hoover was going to win, right? And that's a conversation that we'll have next year in government classes. We'll talk about polling data and why polls sometimes suck, right? But ultimately, FDR is going to come in and he's going to call for a New Deal, right? And this New Deal is something that is meant to piggyback off of his cousin. Remember his cousin? Teddy. Teddy had a what policy? What was Teddy's, not his big stick policy, that was foreign policy. What was Teddy's domestic plan called?
That was.
Return to normalcy?
No, that's Harding. FDR wants a New Deal, but what does that imply? There was some sort of old deal, wasn't there? Right? Or what Teddy called the square deal. Okay? The square deal. For fairness, right? Teddy is that progressive who's going to create a square deal so that laborers can benefit as much as capitalists benefit, right? Promoting unions, busting up the monopolies, right? Those were the things that Teddy Roosevelt did that were a square deal. They're fair for everybody. Now FDR is going to take over and he's going to say, hey, we need a new deal, right? We need a new deal in order to fight the Great Depression. Okay? And this will ultimately signify a significant change in American politics and American governance, right? And the very scope of what government does. Up to this point in American history, right? And we'll go over this again in more detail next year in government. But up to this point in American history, government is the cause of all life's problems.
Yeah.
Okay? And now FDR is going to tell you government is the solution to all life's problems. Right? Which means that if government is the solution, who is the cause?
The government.
No.
The people.
Nope.
President.
President is government.
Money?
We're getting closer now.
The Fed?
Economy.
Well, who controls the economy?
The Fed.
I have no
Congress. I don't know. It's too big.
the judicial branch.
I'll just start throwing names out.
Who? Well, Mark is getting even closer. Corporations. Corporations during the 1920s are left essentially unchecked. They can do whatever they want. Right? Again, when you look at Coolidge, Coolidge was economically conservative. Right? That means that we're not going to engage, we're not going to get involved economically. And if a business wants to allow for labor, or a union, they can do it. And if a business kills a labor union, so be it. We don't care. Right? Now, he's socially progressive. We're going to stop the showing of the KKK movies in the White House that Woodrow Wilson was down for. Right? Okay? We're going to try to promote equality amongst the races and the genders and things like that. Right? But we're not going to touch the economy. And now, because everything went sour, FDR is basically saying the corporations are the cause of the problem. Unchecked capitalism is the cause of the problem. Okay? Is unchecked capitalism ultimately bad? Yeah, completely unchecked capitalism is probably bad. Right? Most of us are willing to admit that there is some level of governmental oversight needed in life. We just disagree about the extent and where. Okay? All right, so good old Franklin, right? He was a New York State Senator. He eventually gets polio. He got polio as an adult in life, right? And doesn't really ever walk again after that point, right? In fact, here's my little statue of FDR, right, in his wheelchair. Okay? In order to exert dominance, right, or look stronger than what he was, there were times in the White House where he would have staff basically like pick him up, right, and they would move him in front of his desk. If he needed to deal with somebody, if he needed to speak to somebody, right, and he couldn't do it from a seated position, okay, because I promise you, try sometime, right, try to yell at somebody while you're sitting and they're standing. It doesn't work very well.
No.
You look just kind of childish, right? And so they would literally pull FDR around and put him in the front, on the front of his desk, and he would sort of sit ever so slightly on the front of his desk and lean here like this so he could hold himself up while he would, you know, basically yell at whoever he needed to yell at, right? And then when they left, he would go back and sit down, right? But he contracts polio as an adult. He doesn't really walk again after that. I mean, he does a little bit with like crutches and canes, but for the most part, he is wheelchair bound for the remainder of his life, right? And as he takes over, he creates the first New Deal, which obviously then implies that there is a second New Deal, which there is, right? And the first New Deal is the idea of taking a whole bunch of intellectuals, and again, this sort of aligns himself more with a Woodrow Wilson progressivism, right? A Woodrow Wilson concept of getting elites, right? Getting experts to come in and begin to run things, right? And so what Roosevelt wants to do is he wants to tackle the banking crisis, right? He wants to encourage something between management and unions in order to sort of mitigate labor problems and labor relations, right? And then he wants to raise depressed commodity prices, right? He wants the prices of goods to increase, right? And again, this is what I mean when I tell you that this is not an inflationary issue. Again, this is a depressive issue, right? All of a sudden, corn is too cheap, right? What happens when corn is too cheap?
Nobody's buying.
Well, no, the problem is that nobody wants to make it, right? Because again, we go back to this basic concept here of supply and demand, right? If this is our basic supply and demand chart, and all of a sudden the price of corn is way down here, what are farmers doing?
They ain't making corn.
They're only making this amount, right? Because anything beyond that is a net loss for them, right? So they're not going to interact in that economy. Therefore, if we want economic growth, right, FDR actually has to see commodity prices rise, right? We actually need to make things more expensive, right? That was actually the economic growth we need at this point. Actually, we'll stop there. Okay?